This is the first in a series of tutorials about using Python scripting with ArcGIS. We will not be a very in-depth exploration of Python or the data structure. However, this tutorial and then several others will explain some basic concepts to help you get a foundational understanding of Python, and then we'll transition into how it can be integrated with ArcGIS. So first, I'm scripting in something called idle. Right? Idle, it's a graphical user interface for Python. Pretty sure when you install ArcGIS, this will come with it. Can't remember if it's also just on Windows machines, but there's other ones, PyWin, so on and so forth. You can pick your favorite. Notice I have two windows up right here. I have a shell, and then I just have one that is opening a script I've written called Action Cliché. Primarily, these tutorials will be here in the shell because I can interactively run stuff, and then we get to see the results, so it's easier to teach. However, oftentimes if you're going to save some kind of script and then integrate it into a tool in ArcGIS, you would write it here and then save it as a Python script. All right, so opened a script here called Action Cliché that we'll refer to occasionally. If I wanted to run it real quick, I could go to Run the module, and it'll run it. Oh, I must save it. It's upset with me. There we go. All right, so first thing, it wants me to initiate self-destruct, so perhaps I'll say no. Right, but it's not liking that. It's going to do it anyway, so on and so forth. Anyone who's watching kind of both screens, you'll notice even though this follows its own order, it seems to be using similar words or phrases or things that are mentioned here. Yada, yada, yada. So silly little script, but we'll use it to kind of teach the introduction. So before we kind of get into learning the basic data structures, I think it's good to take a look at the script and kind of look at some observations. So there's a couple that really stand out. One, different colors, right, for different kind of words. You notice there seems to be, right, a number of different things like import or def or if or else or while, you know, print, raw input, and all of these seem to be in either orange or purple. So this will tip you off that there are some words that are reserved, that you can't necessarily use, right, to store values, which is something we'll talk about in a moment, but that are used for functions, right, or that are used to define things. You'll notice other instances, any time in which there's a green word, right, it seems to have some kind of quotation mark around it. Right? So other things we might notice, numbers seem to be okay being outside of parentheses, but anything, or sorry, outside of quotation marks, or numbers don't necessarily have to be, right, orange or purple, so they're not reserved words. However, there are some, you know, words such as, right, answer or wire color, right, that have to have an equal sign after them. Right? So those are some other things. Just, you know, pay attention to the colors, pay attention to what you're seeing, note the observations. Another big thing to remember here is how it's kind of structured. Right? Notice that I'm doing something here, right? I'm defining some kind of function, and everything else is indented beneath it, meaning that everything that follows is subservient to this command. It'll all be within defining the function. Occasionally I'll do things, right, like if this, then that. Notice when you ask an if, boom, another comment comes below it that becomes subservient to it. Similar here, while, right, it's one we'll get to in a little bit, so long as something is true. And when I integrate the while, right, everything there is subservient to it. And there happens to be something else conditional here, which has its own subservient statements, and so on and so forth. So the indentation plays a really important role. I'll come back to that as we move forward. And the last thing to sort of notice is there's also this kind of red color up here. And it's an important one because this is what allows you to step outside the script and comment on it. Right? So putting the pound sign or hashtag or whatever you want to call it allows you to sort of become an observer. Right? So I am importing a module that has functions around time. Right? So these are the kind of basic ones that we need to do. So let's start with essential data structures. Right? So there's four, well, probably more than four, but there's four we're really going to review here before we move forward. One that's easy to wrap your head around is an integer, right? Blah, blah, blah. We could go on for this forever. Right? An integer is very similar to a float. Only difference is a float has a decimal. Right? Another would be a string, right? A string is a series of characters. And I'm going to do something real quick that's going to fail on purpose. So if I just type string, right, in our minds we see that and think, yes, that appears to be a set of characters. It's upset. What is string? String is not defined. When you want to define a string, right, a series of characters, you need to put it inside quotations. Either double quotes or single quotes, just make sure that it's the same on each side. That can be recognized as a string. Right? So in order for string to show up here or to be able to do something with it, it has to be some kind of function like print. Right? So print string, it will print string. All right? So there's the difference. Like print, type, import. Words, some of which we'll learn later, others of which you can look on online dictionaries for, that are reserved and they do functions, versus a word I'm just making up right here called string. Two other important ones. One you'll see kind of right here, right? Called a list. Right? And a list, put it in square brackets. It can have any number of things in it. It can have a mix of, string characters and a mix of string characters with integers and so on and so forth. And that's a list. A list has a cousin to something that's not here, that we didn't use, but that's called a tuple. Right? A tuple is in parentheses. The difference between a list and a tuple, beyond one being defined by the parentheses and the other being defined by this, is best observed by me going 10 steps ahead for just a moment. So I'm going to import a module that we'll learn how to do later called time. And I'm going to do time local time. Right, so I'm just calling time local time. It's telling me what it is. And notice that what's stored there, right, from here to here, is stored within parentheses. So this is happening behind the scenes. And it's stored in the parentheses because it's a tuple. And a tuple means that it's immutable. Right? So a list, for example, 1, 2, 3, my list, 4, 5. Right? Let's make an easy one. I'm going to call something my list. Right? So we're taking one step slightly ahead right now. We'll come back to this. I'm setting a variable here. Right? I'm creating a list, and then I'm setting it to my list so I can call it later. Right? So we'll make a real easy one that is 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll set a tuple called my tuple, and that also equals, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so if at any point I wanted to, delete from my list, right, what was happening in the first index, and then I said print my list, notice that it did it, right? It deleted what was at the first index point here, right? Now I have only 1, 3, and 4 left, right? I could delete the first thing as well, my list, delete my list, right, at the 0th point, and I'm going to be left with 3 and 4. Right, again, don't get too hung up on these other words that I'm using. I need them to prove the point. We're definitely going to come back to them in a bit, but kind of pay attention noticing that I'm changing my list. So if I try to do the same thing on my tuple, it's not going to be very happy with me. And it doesn't want anything deleted, it doesn't want anything added, it doesn't want anything changed. And saying want is actually a little silly. It does not allow for the data structure to be changed. And the reason it's immutable is because this is meant to store things, right, that you want kept in a certain order. Right? So if behind the scenes there is something that is holding the local time, it makes sense that the local time can't be touched. That anytime you call what's held in the first index, it's the year. Anytime you call what's in the second index point, it's 2. Or sorry, it's a month, then a day, then an hour, then a minute, then a second. I guess the day of the week, day of the year, and is it daylight savings time, right? So you want that order so that anyone who's using this module, right, who's calling on this tuple knows that when they call on the first index, that's always going to be the month, right? If they call on the 0th index, it's always going to be the year. It's not necessarily someone can go behind the scenes and rearrange the order or take something out to ruin the scripts. So that is the essential difference between tuples and lists, right? So again, right, we can do a number, 10. That could also be a float. Put it in brackets, it is no longer a number. It becomes, or sorry, in quotes, it becomes a string. I can make myself a list, and I can make myself a tuple. The last interesting thing we saw before we end this first introduction, right, was I also have the ability to set things to other values, right? So this is the only time when I can type a non-reserved character, right, like my string. If I just typed it, it's going to get angry. But if I take my string and with a single equal, I set it equal to this phrase, this is my string, I can now call my string, and it will know to print. I can now mess around with my string. And anytime S I found, I replaced it. So we're going to continually return to this, but it's important to kind of keep it here with the basic data structure, because it's not its own individual data structure. I'm just creating a variable. I'm creating an object, and I'm setting it to something.